My parents didn't show up for my graduation because my little sister threw a fit. That's when I realized I didn't belong in their world anymore. Before we dive into the story, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. I'm always curious to see how far these stories reach. Now let's get into it. I had spent the last 4 years pouring everything into my studies, sacrificing weekends, late nights, even skipping family dinners to keep my grades up. Graduation was supposed to be my moment, a recognition of all that hard work. But as I scanned the crowd, I realized the people I wanted most to see weren't there. My parents, Gideon and Marla Harper, weren't in the seats they had promised. Instead, I heard whispers that Tori, my 17-year-old sister, had thrown a full-blown tantrum because they refused to buy her an expensive gift she demanded. And just like that, my parents had abandoned me. I tried to hold back tears as cousins and distant relatives offered awkward congratulations. I forced a smile, but inside something cracked. Every childhood memory I had of my parents cheering for my achievements felt like a lie. Tori, always manipulative and spoiled, got whatever she wanted, and I, the older, hardworking daughter, was invisible. That day I realized I had been playing by their rules, hoping for approval I would never receive. Walking across the stage, I promised myself I wouldn't wait for validation from people who clearly didn't care. That night I returned home to an empty house. Tori was gloating about the attention she had stolen, and my parents acted as if nothing had happened. I silently packed a small bag and pulled out the keys to an apartment I had rented months earlier, quietly preparing for the life I knew I had to build on my own. Sitting alone in that new apartment, I felt a mix of heartbreak and relief. It was the first time I realized independence might be my only path to respect and peace. My parents' neglect hurt deeply, but it also ignited a quiet determination inside me. A determination to prove to myself and eventually to them that I was worth far more than their favoritism or approval. That day marked the end of my childhood dependence and the start of my quiet, calculated journey toward freedom and, eventually, revenge. I waited until the house was quiet, the kind of silence that made it feel almost sacred. I moved quickly, slipping clothes, books, and a few keepsakes into my bag, careful not to wake anyone. On the kitchen counter I left a note, short, honest, and controlled. I didn't accuse, didn't beg, didn't plead. I simply told them I was leaving and that I hoped one day they would realize what they had overlooked. The apartment I had rented months ago felt impossibly small, but it was mine. No judgmental eyes, no favoritism, no constant comparison. I unlocked the door and let the quiet of my own space wash over me, a mix of relief and lingering ache settling in my chest. Each box I unpacked was a reminder that I was finally choosing myself, and no one could take that away. I spent the next days in a blur of work. Waitressing, tutoring, and freelance projects. Anything to keep the apartment afloat and build a foundation I could rely on. The exhaustion was real, but it was mine, earned, and meaningful. At night, memories crept in like shadows. I remembered Tori receiving praise for the smallest accomplishments. Perfect grades, a new hairstyle, a social media post that barely mattered. Meanwhile, my late nights studying, my part-time jobs to save money for college, the hours I spent volunteering. Those moments had barely drawn a glance. The contrast stung sharply now, the seeds of betrayal planted long ago finally taking root. I realized it wasn't just about missing graduation or stolen attention. It was years of subtle, constant disregard. And as I turned the key in my new apartment's lock each night, a sense of clarity and determination settled over me. This was more than survival. It was the start of reclaiming myself, of building a life where I was valued, where I would never again be invisible, and where the echoes of their favoritism could no longer hold power over me. Life in my new apartment became a rhythm I had never known, one I shaped entirely on my own terms. I discovered a quiet strength in managing everything myself. Paying bills, cooking meals, organizing my schedule. Every completed task felt like a small victory, proof that I didn't need anyone's approval to survive, let alone thrive. It was around this time that I met Caleb, a former colleague of my father's who had once tutored me in a summer program. He recognized my determination and work ethic immediately and became a steady voice of encouragement. "You're worth more than you think," he told me one evening over coffee. His belief in me sparked a confidence I hadn't realized I'd lost in the shadow of my family. I began enrolling in online courses and workshops, learning skills that could elevate my career. Each certificate, each completed module became another layer of independence, a shield against the past I was determined to leave behind. I also started quietly saving money, creating a safety net that I knew would give me leverage someday, proof that I could outlast their favoritism and manipulation. In the stillness of my apartment at night, anger toward my family simmered beneath a calm surface. I thought about the countless times they had undervalued my efforts, celebrated Tori's mediocrity, and dismissed my ambitions. That anger no longer felt paralyzing. It was fuel, a reminder of why I had chosen this path. Yet alongside the anger was a cautious satisfaction. For the first time I felt untethered from their control. No one could demand my obedience, no one could dictate my worth. I was free, and that freedom tasted like victory. Each morning I woke with purpose, each night I slept with pride. The world they had tried to confine me in no longer existed, and for the first time, I realized that strength could grow quietly, invisibly, until it was unshakable. One evening my phone rang. I recognized Tori's number immediately. Her voice was syrupy, fake with concern. "Sila, I miss you. Can we talk?" Every word dripped with manipulation, and I could hear the calculations behind it. I let the call go to voicemail, refusing to give her the satisfaction of a response. Not long after, I started noticing subtle shifts from my parents. Gideon's emails hinted at disappointment. Marla's voice over the phone carried that familiar edge of guilt tripping. They dropped vague lines about family obligations and loyalty, attempting to make me feel like the outsider I had always been accused of being. I listened, nodded silently, but inside I felt no fear, only clarity. Their control had limits, and I was learning exactly where. It became obvious how fragile their so-called perfect image really was. The constant polish they showed to the outside world masked cracks that were growing wider each day. Their anxiety over appearances, Tori's tantrums, and their reliance on keeping me in check were threads I could quietly pull on if I chose to. I began laying the groundwork for a subtle but precise plan. I connected with professionals I respected, cultivating contacts in legal, financial, and local community circles. I didn't advertise my intentions, and I certainly didn't involve Tori or my parents. Each connection was a quiet reinforcement of my independence and an invisible tool to counteract the power they thought they still held over me. Sitting alone at night, I allowed a small, private satisfaction to settle in. For the first time, I wasn't reacting, I was strategizing. While they attempted to manipulate, guilt, and maintain appearances, I was quietly building a structure that could challenge their dominance without confrontation. Their empire of control was brittle, and I was learning how to exploit that fragility, patiently, carefully, and with the certainty that when the time came, it would crumble on its own. While handling a few errands one afternoon, I stumbled across documents tucked away in an old family filing cabinet, things that revealed just how precarious my parents' finances really were. Their polished home, fancy cars, and curated social life weren't signs of success. They were a facade built on debt, risky investments, and the careful exploitation of Tori's compliance. Each paper, each ledger I examined, made it clear how much they relied on appearances and manipulation to hold everything together. I began quietly cataloging what I found, making careful notes, taking photos of statements, and storing copies in a secure location only I could access. I didn't act on it yet. There was no rush. The satisfaction came from knowing the truth, from realizing how thin the veil of their so-called perfection actually was. The irony wasn't lost on me. They had spent my whole life teaching me to value family above all. Yet here they were, clinging to status and control while sacrificing honesty and fairness. Thinking back on my childhood, I felt the sting of countless overlooked moments. My achievements had been ignored, my sacrifices minimized, while Tori's smallest accomplishments were paraded as extraordinary. Each memory reinforced the injustice I had endured and fueled a simmering determination to ensure that, eventually, the scales would tip. Sitting at my small kitchen table, surrounded by stacks of papers and receipts, I felt a mixture of validation and anger. Validation because I had seen the truth firsthand, anger because it underscored years of emotional neglect and favoritism. But there was no frantic impulse, only a calm, deliberate understanding that I didn't need to confront them to win. Their cracks were visible now, and I would let their own mismanagement and hypocrisy expose them fully. I allowed myself a small, private smirk, realizing that patience was now my ally. I didn't have to lift a finger for the moment of reckoning to arrive. All I needed was time, strategy, and the knowledge that their empire of control was built on a foundation far weaker than they, or Tori, ever imagined. The betrayal they had shown me had planted seeds, and now, quietly, I was watching them grow into something that could ultimately dismantle the illusion of their perfection. One morning, I received a tip from a contact I had been cultivating, a subtle warning about one of my parents' latest financial moves. They were backing an extravagant venture solely to fund Tori's latest obsession, and the project was far more precarious than anyone outside the family realized. I didn't need to act overtly. Instead, I started leveraging small, anonymous measures, filing questions, requesting audits, and nudging regulatory checks that slowed the scheme's progress. Each minor delay rippled outward, forcing my parents to scramble. Watching them navigate the complications from afar brought a quiet thrill I hadn't anticipated. Gideon's usual composure was cracking, Marla's confident tone now faltered when speaking to advisors, and Tori's entitlement began to clash with reality in ways that were almost painful to witness. Every call they made, every frantic meeting they scheduled, only confirmed how fragile their constructed world had become. I felt a sharp sense of vindication as I saw their control slipping, not through confrontation but through the very systems they had depended on. It was as if the very tools they had ignored or manipulated for years were now bending back toward me. I didn't gloat, didn't boast. I simply observed, savoring the knowledge that patience and careful planning were proving more effective than any impulsive revenge could have been. Late at night, alone in my apartment, I allowed myself a small, private smile. Each tiny setback I orchestrated was like a quiet message. The family they thought untouchable was now vulnerable. Their polished facade was starting to crack, and I could see the stress lines that had never existed before. The satisfaction wasn't just about revenge, it was about justice and balance. For the first time, I felt in control not just of my life, but of the subtle dismantling of the illusion my parents had spent decades cultivating. The experience taught me something I hadn't realized before. True power didn't need to be loud or dramatic. It could be precise, invisible, and devastatingly effective, and I was beginning to master it. Tori's demands escalated faster than anyone could anticipate, and suddenly, the resources her parents had poured into keeping her content were draining faster than they could manage. Vendors complained, contractors delayed projects, and even their social circle began to whisper about the family's instability. Tori, accustomed to immediate gratification, couldn't understand why her whims were no longer met without friction, and for the first time she felt frustration instead of power. I watched from a distance, keeping myself detached. There was no rush to intervene, no gloating, just a clear, patient observation. My parents, usually so polished and composed, began arguing in ways they had carefully hidden for years. Public dinners and family gatherings turned into tense negotiations, their vulnerability exposed for anyone paying attention. Every slip they made reinforced what I had suspected all along. Their perfect image was a delicate illusion. Meanwhile, I leaned on those who truly mattered. Caleb continued to encourage me, reminding me that my independence and focus were building a life far beyond their fragile control. Friends I had made since leaving home offered practical advice and emotional support, celebrating small victories in my career and personal growth. Their belief in me was steady, unwavering, and grounding. As I observed the fallout at home, a strange mix of satisfaction and calm surged through me. Tori's tantrums, which had once terrified my parents, were now backfiring spectacularly, revealing cracks in the family dynamic that no one could ignore. The panic in their eyes, the tension in their voices, it was proof that their control was slipping, and I had done nothing overt to make it happen. I allowed myself a quiet, private sense of vindication. Watching the consequences unfold naturally was more powerful than any direct confrontation could have been. Each argument, each setback, each awkward social moment served as a reminder that I was no longer the powerless child in their world. For the first time, I realized I could remain strong and unaffected while the chaos I had only gently nudged into motion reshaped their reality. The tension that had been building for months finally erupted. Contractors halted projects, creditors called incessantly, and social invitations once taken for granted were quietly rescinded. My parents, so used to projecting confidence, now faced glaring scrutiny from friends, neighbors, and colleagues. Their carefully curated image of stability and success was unraveling before anyone's eyes. Tori's world shifted too. The privileges she had always expected, designer clothes, lavish outings, and endless indulgence, were suddenly restricted. She lashed out at first, then sulked and finally began to direct her frustration toward my parents. For the first time she understood that her whims had consequences, and the perfect bubble they had lived in was gone. I watched everything unfold from my apartment, a calm observer in contrast to the chaos at home. There was no gloating, only a quiet acknowledgement that the patience and preparation I had invested were paying off. The cracks I had noticed months ago had widened, and now the collapse was undeniable. In the stillness of that evening I allowed myself to reflect. I remembered walking across the stage at graduation, the sting of empty seats where my parents should have been, the humiliation and heartbreak of being overlooked once again. Comparing that memory to this moment, I felt a deep private satisfaction. Justice wasn't loud or dramatic. It had been patient, precise, and inevitable. For the first time, I fully understood the power of stepping back and letting consequences unfold naturally. My family's facade, built over decades, had shattered not by confrontation but by the careful, invisible pressure I had applied. And in that quiet distance, I felt a sense of completion, a balance restored, and a future finally unburdened by their manipulation. With months of careful planning behind me, I used my savings to launch a small but thriving business. The work was challenging, demanding every ounce of focus and creativity I could muster, but it was entirely mine, built from effort, intelligence, and determination rather than entitlement or favoritism. Soon after, I purchased my first home, a modest place that represented everything my parents had never given me: autonomy, stability, and pride in my own accomplishments. I stayed aware of my family's continued difficulties, hearing bits of news through acquaintances and neighborhood whispers. There was a strange comfort in knowing that their struggles persisted, yet I remained completely detached, unaffected by their chaos. I didn't gloat, didn't revel publicly. This was my triumph, private and unshakable. Each day I felt the weight of their approval lift further from my shoulders. The longing I once had for recognition or acceptance dissolved into clarity. I realized I didn't need them to validate my worth or define my success. I had already proven it to myself. Sitting in my new home, I allowed a quiet sense of accomplishment to settle in. My independence wasn't just financial. It was emotional, spiritual, and unassailable. The years of manipulation and neglect had forged a resilience I had never fully appreciated until now. I was finally free, untethered from the chains of their control, and stronger than I had ever imagined. The life I had built wasn't perfect, but it was mine. Every choice, every struggle, and every small victory was a testament to my perseverance. And for the first time, I understood that true triumph didn't require anyone's approval. It required only courage, patience, and the unwavering belief that I could create the life I deserved. I walked into my parents' home with steady steps, carrying only myself and the quiet confidence I had earned over years of struggle. Their faces registered surprise, maybe even a flicker of fear as they saw how composed I had become. I spoke calmly, each word deliberate, explaining how their favoritism and neglect had shaped the resolve that now defined me. Torai shuffled awkwardly beside them, attempting an apology that sounded empty, rehearsed, and unconvincing. I didn't argue, didn't raise my voice. I simply let the truth land, unembellished, as they absorbed the reality of what their actions had caused. In that room, I wasn't the overlooked child anymore. I was the one who had quietly built a life they could neither influence nor undo. Their polished image, their control, their sense of superiority, it all seemed fragile under the weight of its own collapse. Leaving their home, I felt a calm satisfaction unlike any I had known. The revenge I had envisioned wasn't loud or vindictive. It was the creation of a life they could never touch, the quiet unraveling of the illusion they had relied on for so long. I thought about every moment of betrayal, every sting of favoritism, and recognized how those experiences had forged resilience, clarity, and self-reliance in me. For the first time, freedom felt absolute. I had respect, purpose, and peace, all earned through patience and determination rather than confrontation. Their choices had led them to their own downfall, and I was no longer tethered to their world. I was the architect of my own happiness, finally in control and fully unshaken. Do you think I did the right thing by walking away from my family, or should I have tried to give them another chance? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. I'm really curious. If you want more stories like mine, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications.